Welcome to Global Grit Conversations, where resilience, leadership, and impact meet across borders. I'm Pamela Campagna, Global Advisor, Professor, and founder of Blue Sage Consulting. Each episode features candid conversations with leaders, builders, and thinkers from around the world who share the moments that tested their resilience and the insights that shaped who they became. This is Global Grit Conversations. So welcome, Kellee Franklin, to Global Grit Conversations. I'm so excited to hear what we're going to talk about today, and I'm thrilled that you could find the time to be with us today. So welcome.
It's lovely to be with you always, Pamela. I appreciate the invitation to be here.
So let's get started. This is probably a softball, but who is Kellee right now? Tell us a little bit about where you are and what you've been working on.
I just transitioned off of a major engagement with a global management and technology consulting firm and springboarding into a keynote speech next week on AI and healthcare that I'm super excited about. And so I'm looking forward to the future, but a little bit of it is uncertain. But that is sort of thematic of where we are just again with the Easter season and Passover and turning from winter to springtime. So I look at all of those things when I look at life. So it's nice to be here and kind of take some time to reflect on that.
Interesting timing, right? Interesting times we're living in. And
For
you
sure.
mentioned speaking at giving a keynote at a healthcare conference. Is there any associations that you draw with some of what you're going to be talking about and maybe some of your lived experiences?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this wonderful company in Ohio, they're a global engineering design company, and they do amazing work all around the world, putting innovative thought into how they artfully design patient-centered facilities, not only in the healthcare space, but in different industries as well. But they heard my keynote speech that I did in Dubai last year in and around AI technologies. And so they invited me in for a conversation. And when they found out that I actually am a breast cancer survivor, they were even more excited to learn that I had that lived experience of the patient and that my background in human-centered design, along with the advanced technologies, could really help their audience understand how they could leverage technology, design, strategy, but also really do it from a very thoughtful and meaningful perspective of putting the patient at the center of their wonderful and innovative ways that they do their work.
And so you use the phrase human-centered design for some that may not be familiar with that term. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, it's kind of the convergence of three main things. It's what technologies are out on the marketplace and what's available. It's what kind of drives people to the marketplace. But more importantly, it's what people want. And it's the convergence of those three things. And oftentimes what happens in industries is we will lean heavily into the bright, shiny objects of what technologies are available or what the market has that is available. But we spend less time really thinking about or asking the questions of what the people within the organizations or industries that we're designing for will actually use. And my contention is always like, if we're going to put something in an organization, we might as well build it with the intention and for the people who are going to use it, because otherwise it's just not cost effective and not very meaningful for the organization.
So people first, not
People
technology
first. People first.
Yeah.
And it has a very significant, people always wonder, well, that seems very time consuming to do all that upfront asking questions and all of those sorts of things. I can't recall if you and I have shared this, if I've shared this story with you. I lost my dad 10 days after I graduated from undergrad, and it really shifted my thinking about life, living, and it probably still to this day was the most transformational learning moment for me. And fresh out of undergrad, you kind of think you know everything, but you don't know anything. And he had stood up the Organization Development and Learning Center at GAO. If you don't know what GAO, it's the Government Accountability Office. And at that time, he was a decorated federal service employee, finished his career at the University of Maryland, and there were 4 speakers who were distinguished who were lined up to speak at his memorial service at the College Park, which is a beautiful chapel on University of Maryland campus. A woman approached my mom a few days before his memorial service and asked if she could say a few words at his service. And my mom was like, "Of course, we'd love to have you speak." Well, she was the last one to speak, Pamela. And she was clearly the only one that wasn't a professional speaker. And she got up in front of this packed chapel and she said, every morning, Mr. Franklin made sure I had a hot cup of coffee, and he would sit and spend some time with me and ask me how I was, ask me how my family was. And she said, I'll never forget him. And she was the janitor in his building. And I can tell you, out of all of those distinguished speakers, that's the only speech I remember. And as a young kid, fresh out of undergrad, I had one of those cathartic moments where I was like, that's it. That's what this is all about. That's what this is all about. So I had that early experience that I think imprinted on me. So all of the things that you and I have gone through as professionals, I think my lens was always sort of changed and altered because of that. But the business impact of doing that work up front is really consequential down the line, because if you involve the people in the system, in the technical design, they're going to be more engaged, more involved, more invested, and a more invested population within your organizational system, the more willing they are to use the technology. The more educated they'll be on the technology, and it's just going to benefit the business all around.
And so this was, you mentioned a speech that you gave on AI in Dubai. Was that the Global Innovation Summit that you're talking about?
It was, yeah. So I sit on the board of advisor for a great organization that is called the Global Innovation Institute. It's headquartered out of Michigan, but we have wonderful advisors from all over the world, people who are recognized as thought leaders in their respective areas of the world. And we identify thought leaders who are doing amazing forward-thinking things in their countries. And annually, we have a Global Innovation Summit. Last year, it was held in Dubai, where I was a keynote speaker. And we offer awards to really people who are doing amazing work. And this year, unfortunately, it was scheduled for Saudi Arabia, but with the introduction of some disruption in the Middle East, that summit got postponed for December. But we still gave out the awards, and the awards go from like medical interventions to AI technologies to educational, programming that people are doing. So, and this kind of goes in line with my thinking around innovation. Innovation is relevant. People always tend to think of innovation, it's got to be the bright, shiny object, AI technology. And you and I both know as persons who've worked in a variety of different organizations that it's really dependent on what the organization or what the system needs. And the Global Innovation Institute kind of honors that. If a organization or a system needs educational programming, that's monumentally innovative to that system. Or if you're working in a medical device company, maybe it's a different type of innovation, but it runs along a continuum. And that's why I love being affiliated with the Global Innovation Institute, because they recognize all kinds of innovation. It doesn't need to look one way for it to be considered innovative. After I graduated with my master's degree, I ended up working for the local municipal government that I had done my graduate internship with, and was doing, I guess, what you and I would consider innovative work, talking about that continuum of innovation, because I was going around to different departments and having cross conversation, which for them was innovative. Because as you know, most organizations, and even now, still work in silos. Booz Allen Hamilton was rolling out a national technology for first responders and intelligence professionals. And they had heard about my work. And they were having difficulty at that time with this technology of getting users to adopt the technology, because they had the technologists and the intel professionals who developed the technology as the ones who were going out to the field to introduce the technology to them. And they were talking in technical language. So I got recruited to come and work at Booz Allen, and that kind of launched my career. And so in essence, I became the translator between the super smart technical intelligence analysts and those, what I always say, I'm cowgirl enough to understand that different users need different kinds of language when you go out and you talk to them about technical. So I became the translator between those two entities. So I started my career in essence in defense and intelligence. And interestingly enough, Pamela, and I know you understand this, is defense and intelligence was already doing things like design thinking, human-centered design, just because of the nature of their work. It may not have really necessarily been defined those ways,
Yeah.
but it was just the nature of the way they worked. They didn't care who was at the table to solve those problems. They were complex and they were complicated. They needed different thinkers around the table to solve the problems. And so I feel very fortunate that I spent so many years in defense and intelligence because I just was learning things that I would later come to understand was not really things that were the norm in most industries.
And so when you think about your career, interestingly enough, starting in defense and logistics, so look back at your career, is there a particular moment that has had an impact?
You know, that's always a tricky question because I think every single engagement that I've had with clients, I consider what you and I do as a people business, right? So I feel like every single thing that I've had the good fortune to do has left an imprint on my heart. But there are certain ones that stand out. I was working with a team at the Pentagon when the 9/11 tragedy happened. And I was fortunate that I wasn't located at the Pentagon on that day. I actually happened to be at another military site in Pennsylvania on that day. But I had to help my clients at the Pentagon in the aftermath navigate through that time. And I take that as a very precious honor that I was able to be there for them. And it became less about, as you can imagine, less about what we were working on and more about the human experience that we were all walking through. So I feel very privileged by that. And again, when I think about the trajectory of my entire career, to me, it's more of those moments in helping people either maybe transition out of like Booz Allen into something maybe that they cared, more passionately about, or dealing with a difficult situation at work, then maybe, the more traditional monumentous things. I remember distinctly, and I've brought this up before with friends of mine, after 9/11, a lot of people at Booz Allen were motivated to leave the firm and go and join either the military or maybe go join a federal service position. I remember one woman who worked for me. She was a wonderful employee, but she got called to go work for the State Department. And I remember at her going away luncheon, she stood up and she talked about how hard it was for her to make that decision because how much she loved working for me and how supported she felt. But she just felt called to do something different after the incident. And so, I mean, to me, that's the greatest compliment I could ever be given. So it's those types of things rather than, oh my gosh, I brought in this like multi-million-dollar contract. And that's not to diminish those sorts of things on my career path, but it's those other things for me that mean a lot.
Yes. Well, and so you've mentioned now two inflection points, and in Global Grit Conversations, the people we've been talking to have expressed those monumental, the memorable moments that have really shifted their thinking or set them on a different path, or, as you say, encouraged me to look at life with a different lens. And those are incredibly important moments because they can often do change the trajectory of where you're going to be going next. So I wonder for you, you've dabbled in different industries, traditional roles. You certainly have the
human-centered, people-first approach. And we cross paths in higher education at a university. So I'm curious, how did you find your way into academia?
Well, I always thought that that's where I would land full time. So when I was at Booz Allen, I was crazy enough to think, and I guess I was crazy because I worked full time and I worked on my doctorate, and with the intention of finding a full-time faculty position. But as I continued throughout my professional career, I felt that there was a nice intersection between, if this makes sense, and I think it will to you as a practitioner, I felt like the industry needed academic thinking because they would put together, let's say, consulting models that had no underpinning in theoretical or any sort of muscle. And then conversely, I found in my academic teaching that you had great, minds who were teaching wonderful theories and theoretical models and frameworks. And yet my graduate students I've taught primarily at graduate executive level weren't getting the knowledge and practical infusion that I felt that they needed, that was going to help them be successful in integration of the two. So I felt like I was having more impact by coming in from industry, but leveraging the knowledge that I had gained academically to sort of help practitioners be more effective. And also kind of a third Venn diagram, if you will, to that was my lived experience, having, which I don't think we do enough of. And it's part of what Brene Brown speaks, I think, so impactfully of is, being vulnerable and talking about, the human experience, and being vulnerable and sharing, about impact of my dad and sharing that I'm a breast cancer survivor and sharing some of these things so that our business students in particular recognize that we're not superhumans, right? We all have these lived experiences, and I feel like the reason why we kind of go through these journeys is to learn and to take that learning and sort of integrate that into our lives so we can share that with others.
It's a different definition of learning.
Yeah.
It's learning. It's not textbook learning. It's not conceptual or theoretical, but it's learning through others' lived experiences. And to be honest with you, that is the premise for this podcast series. It's about learning through others, by others. And I want to come back to a comment you made about being a breast cancer survivor. And you've also shared with me that you're currently a caregiver for your mother. And, this is something that so many of us are familiar with and have or will be soon working through and having to manage. And so I wonder for you, how has the combination of caring for yourself and now caring for a family member, how has that shaped your understanding of resilience or fortitude or grit? Has it changed it at all?
I think I'm still a work in progress. So I think I'm working on my expert level because interestingly enough, as a neighbor shared with me, you never really got to have your own recovery because I bounced right from going through my experience to my mom starting to have her decline. And she's in great shape. So I'm grateful. She's 88 years young. She swims 3 days a week and she walks every day and probably could, outrace me, but she's 88 and
Right.
she has where she needs support. It just, I think going through my own experience, and I'm not typically a person who asks for help. And there's a whole interesting podcast we could have on that alone
Yes,
on
I just made a mental note. Yes.
if you're a person that not doesn't typically need that, and then you have to ask for help because there's just no other choice. You grow.
Why do you think? I'm sorry. Help.
Oh my gosh, I think there's probably a large number of reasons. You've got family systems packed into that with just your own, personality. And then I think that there's all sorts of mental model that gets built up along your path that gets
Uh-huh.
reinforced by, even the discipline that you go through in school, to a whole variety of things is
Uh-huh.
I was an athlete, a competitive athlete. I mean, so that gets reinforced in you. You don't ask for help even though you're on a team. I mean, it's just,
Right.
all
Yep.
of these things that you get kind of reinforced. But you do, at least in my experience, I grew a great deal of empathy. I was already had a high degree of empathy as a person anyways. But when you go through something like that, I think you realize how vulnerable we really are. And that,
Right.
I was diagnosed at a relatively young age. And so you realize the fragility of life. I think having lost my father when I was 22, it has made me hypersensitive to losing my other parent. And, I feel that, because I mentioned early in our conversation, I'm a faith-based person. So there's a degree of feeling like it's my duty
Uh-huh.
to be there for my parent and to honor that commitment. So there's a lot of things to unpack with that, but there's a whole lot of research and literature behind the challenges for caregivers, and our family system is falling right into what the literature is, that it typically falls on one child. I've read where some family systems do it, really collaboratively, but I'm recognizing that it's not necessarily a team sport. It's kind of an
Right.
individual contributor. So, we're learning and growing as a family to try to figure that all out, but it's not easy, and I wish it were. I'm gonna blame Western society a little bit on that,
Yeah.
because again, I think this is
That's
probably a
real.
broader podcast. Our society is a little bit of a throwaway. Once things become unusable, we throw them away, whether
Uh-huh.
it's an iPad or, we just toss things away. And I think we do a poor disservice to our wise citizens, where in Eastern culture, they're revered and they're honored, and families take them in and learn from them and grow and try to understand. And I just don't think we do a very good job here in Western society.
And what do you think, looking at the generations at work and looking at you yourself, even of a certain age, any experiences about being at this point in your career in work environments? Do you see any patterns? Do you have any insights around that?
Well, interestingly enough, I just did a LinkedIn post last week because there was a great Fast Company article, and that our workplaces are in need of, and it called out like in need of women over 50 because of the wisdom they bring, the calmness they
Mhm.
bring, the lived experiences they bring. So, they may not offer the technical prowess. And we could, again, go into another podcast about this, because I have a
Mhm.
whole model I've created about, as you move through your career advancement, you really need to develop greater conscious leadership skills rather than these
Mhm.
hardcore technical skills. And as you and I both know, having experience in higher education, the focus now is on technical. And as I told my friends at Amazon when they called me in for a conversation, I said, most people in my experience can learn technical skills. It's very difficult to teach people to have a compassionate heart. And so I think that our organizations, and I'd love to hear your experience, our organizations are crying for an adult in the room. I think they're looking for leadership. I think they're looking for compassionate leadership. We
Uh-huh.
have designed organizations and continue to use organizations, even though I loved a 1999 book called The Web of Inclusion, and I was very
Yes.
hopeful that we would adjust to that, but we haven't gotten there
Mm.
yet, where it was much more flat, much more collaborative, but we're still working in silos. We're still working very hierarchical. We're still working with the strongest and loudest person in the room.
Uh-huh.
And, top-down sabotage is a thing, unfortunately. But we've got younger folks coming into organizations who've gone to business schools, who have, I think, overemphasized, and this is Kellee Franklin's opinion, overemphasized the technical and not focused on some of these leadership skills. And they're working very mechanistically and not very humanistically, yet they come in and they're crying out for compassionate leadership. And I can tell you that because I did 4 global presentations at Oliver Wyman last year to resounding success because the conversation was on resilience, on psychological safety, on much more humanistic types of things because people are craving that.
And I would say the recognition that leadership can come from anywhere in the organization is truly important. And like you, I've taught and have been teaching leadership skills and management for 30 years now at the executive level and in higher education. And it's not only the recognition and the acknowledgement that those human skills, what used to be called soft skills, but they're human skills, are valued. And World Economic Forum recently put out a report on skills in the upper right quadrant. What are the more important skills? It's compassion, it's critical thinking, it's listening skills, it's developing interactive and team-based aptitude. And this should be another podcast actually. But
what your audience, should know is that as AI continues to take over so many of the skills, or so many of the things in organizations, my great hope is that it's going to liberate us to be more interactive face-to-face with people. Back to the beginning of when I started in organizations where we actually were collaborating. So the emphasis is going to be on all of those things. And if we don't have those skills, which, I'm sure you've experienced this. I know that I have, and it's frustrating for me when you go into an organization and everybody's on a laptop. And I know people may say, well, that's very old school. And I'm like, I've worked at the highest levels of our government, and I've worked at the highest levels of some of the most sophisticated companies in the world. And I can tell you, I have never gone into a high-level meeting where everybody's on a laptop. And so, for some reason, we've made that shift where we feel like we have to always be plugged in, plugged on, and, rather than attending to the physical person that's right in front of us. So, yeah.
And I think with getting back to AI and some of the more social impacts, the differentiator in all of this is going to be the human factor.
I totally agree with you. I always tell my graduate students, because as you know, they always want to know, what's the magic bullet? What's the change model or theory or framework that's going to revolutionize these organizations? And I say, you know what the one thing is that I have found as the most transformative thing for organizations? And they're like, what? And I said, you are the instrument of change. So if you work on you will have more impact in organizations than any framework or theory or that I could ever provide you. I said, I can share those with you, but your presence, your good questions are what's going to make the difference. And kind of along those same lines, I go over to Bangkok because I went through my doctoral program with the Thai Nationals. I get the luxury and the benefit of going over to Thailand almost every year, which I love, and working with doctoral students. This was last year, the year before, I was over there for about a month. And of course, they all wanted to work on AI. This is a human development group of doctoral students. And in Thailand, the doctoral students aren't necessarily academics, they're professionals. So PhD in Thailand is different than maybe necessarily in the United States. So these are all kind of vice president level folks who are coming back to get their doctorate. But they all wanted to focus their work on AI. So we did all of their little mini projects over the course of 4 weeks on AI. And their comprehensive wrap up of all these 4 little mini projects was the human element, how important the human element was. And so at the conclusion of their projects and their wrap up, I said, do you all know who you need to be talking to? And they were like, who? I said, you need to go across the quad and you need to go talk to the data innovation department. I said, because their program is growing leaps and bounds and your program is kind of staying stagnant. And I said, and I can guarantee you one thing, they're not talking about you. And that's what I have found, Pamela, in these academic houses, is that these data analytic data programs are growing leaps and bounds, but they're not introducing, at least in what I've experienced, anything like you introduce or like I
Mhm.
introduce. But in these human development programs, they're recognizing that, oh my gosh, if we don't learn the impact of AI or how to integrate AI or how to, we're going to, but they're not talking to each other.
Yep.
And you and I both know what happens in academia translates, it's just a microcosm of what happens in large organizations. So that's happening in organizations. The technologists are not talking to the human factors people who could really transform our organizational systems to human systems. I underscore that, human systems.
Human systems. And
Yeah.
it's funny you mention this because I was talking to a client of mine the other day, and they said, we want to integrate AI into the organization, and I've been working with them on that. They said, and I feel like I need to hire somebody that's going to own it. So I probably need somebody in IT. And I was like,
Yep.
that's the biggest mistake. No,
Yep.
no. So to
Yep.
your point, it's also about how we in business or society, in organizations around the world, how we interpret this. And so I guess one question I would have for you is, you talked about responsibility, personal, professional responsibility and change. And there are most people I talk to these days are feeling exhausted or overwhelmed by a number of different factors, whether they're geopolitical, whether they're personal. And so what would you say right now? What's one small step that you would invite someone to take to maybe take a step back and regroup, if you will? It sounds like you've done that a couple of times in your career.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great invitation. And I think, this is a great weekend to start, as we mentioned at the start of the conversation. This is a great kind of liberating weekend of reflection and renewal. And what I have done, so I've spent the last, 25 years really sort of introducing myself into Eastern philosophy
Sure.
and practices, which is built around a lot of contemplative and reflective practices, which I'm a huge believer in, not only in the academic work that you and I do, but in corporate life. And I think it's a way that we get in a deeper place of knowing and a deeper connection to things that really truly matter. And so it's incorporating things that work for us. So I would invite your audience to check out the tree of contemplative practices. They can find that through an easy Google search, because oftentimes when I introduce contemplative practices, people think, oh my gosh, I got to sit on a yoga mat for 30 minutes and there's no way I can do that. But it can be like, if you're into musical instruments, or you're into walking, or you're into hiking, or you're into running, or whatever you can do to remove yourself away from the noise, because we are so digitally connected now that it's difficult for us really to kind of unplug. So much so that, over 20 years ago, I did my dissertation research and entitled it Disconnected, because I was concerned about the avalanche that was forthcoming with all of these technologies, and my concern for the human experience. So whatever practices you can put in place that help you do that and to train yourself, whether it's I'm not going to watch TV for however long, and just, we don't have, those are choices we make.
And
right?
these are our practices, right?
These are
something.
practices. So let me just give you, I do little tests for myself. So when I went over to Thailand, and again, I told you I go on a pretty regular basis, I was like, I'm going to test myself this 3 or 4 weeks that I'm in Thailand. I'm not going to take pictures. And I'm telling you, it is hard. But
It's changing a habit, right?
It's changing a habit, but it's so worth it, because you really start to be more present with yourself. You start to become more observant. You start to recognize and realize other people's behaviors. Because I went on a faculty retreat with the people at the university, and just how they were so attached to their phone and to taking pictures. And I was the only person that was like sitting there, like not doing it. So it's really kind of interesting. And then I taught with a woman at Seattle University, and she and I were very much aligned with this whole notion of contemplative practices. And she taught undergrads in the communications department. And she did a a tech liberation weekend. And she
Uh-huh.
challenged her students, undergrads, which I think, may be a little bit harder, to not use technology the whole
Mhm.
weekend, any variety of technology.
Yep.
And she said, hands down, they always came back and said they gained a greater understanding of
Mhm.
themselves, of what mattered to them, what they valued, what was less important to them. And I mean, I think we could all use those times. I'd be curious if there's things you do that.
Yes. And well, actually, what I was going to mention was a colleague of mine, Patty Bell Hastings. She's a professor at Quinnipiac, Connecticut, and she's developed an entire program called Digital Detox. It's an incredible. Actually, you can find it online, but which is tongue in cheek, right?
Yeah.
But it's a self-paced program. And she and I have compared notes on stopping certain practices, like what you did in Thailand with taking the pictures, and instead being in the moment, or sitting down and leaving the phone behind. Don't bring it with you. But it's also, I think, not just using devices, but it's also about how we rely on them for information instead of, I'm a gardener, right? So today I was looking up something about transplanting some of my seedlings. It's that time of year here in New England. And normally I would just ask one of my friends, my gardening friends, but instead, I take a picture on Google Lens and I look it up. And so I think there's small steps that we can also take. But
Well,
I mean, go
well,
ahead.
and to kind of relate it to, because oftentimes, particularly at the graduate and the executive level,
Mhm.
you may get a couple eye rolls. I always remind them, if you look at like Chris Argyris's work and Donald
Mhm.
Schoen's work out of Harvard, I mean, these gentlemen were pioneers in talking about reflecting in and on action. And so they westernized what
Mhm.
Eastern philosophy has known for a long time, that our job when we're in organizational life, and Fascal Hogue just wrote a great piece out of Fast Company talking about calm. How do we remain calm? And you kind of, this relates to, we got a lot of geopolitical stuff going on around the world. Of organizational leadership is, how do we remain centered in the midst of uncertainty and
Mhm.
chaos and craziness, and right? And these are just practices that help us do that. And so, our job, as Donald Schoen talks about, is not only to be able to reflect, after something's happened, but to be in the middle of a meeting and to be able to say, I don't think that's right. And to not be reactive to that. And I think what technology unfortunately has done, and it's gotten a lot of people into trouble, is something pops up on Facebook, on Insta, or whatever, and we make an immediate assumption about things and we react. And what these skills build in us is resilience, but it creates a pause. It allows us to build wisdom and to become less reactive to things, which is so important. And it goes all the way back to my defense and intelligence years, because if you had people working in defense and intelligence who were just like, reactive all the time, things would be a lot much more worse. But, you
Mhm.
want leaders who are grounded, who are centered, who are thoughtful, who are
Mhm.
calm. And so I remind leaders that this is not some, hokey thing, that this is really grounded not only in some Eastern philosophy, but it's got roots all the way over to Western, and also the academic groundedness to it.
Yeah. And so when when you think about this conversation here and some of the topics that it's raised, what would be one message that you'd like to people to take away with regard to grit after hearing what you've had to say?
Well, it's been a great conversation, first of all, as it always
Yes.
is when I talk to you. I think that we have to realize that life is a journey, that we can't always predict where things are going to go, that to be open and receptive to where that journey is taking us, and that it's a lifelong learning,
Mhm.
and that the people that we meet along the way are our best teachers, and that, to me, it's less about pushing harder, but kind of working with the waves that are presented to us. I had a Native American student one time who shared in a class I was teaching at the University of Washington. And he said that, in their tribe, it was known that when you are trying to get water, you don't use the cup against the grain of the tides, but you go with. I thought that was so telling to even just how we work. So I try. It's not always easy, but as things present themselves, I try to be grateful for what I've been given and try to go with it rather than fight too much, because I think when we fight, that's when pain happens and suffering and some of those things. So I think grit can look a lot of different ways. When I think back to when I was an athlete, I probably would have defined it much differently than I define it today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Kellee, thank you so much for your wisdom and this wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
We hope today's conversation offered insights that you can use in your own journey. Subscribe for future episodes with global leaders, entrepreneurs, practitioners, emerging voices, and unexpected guests. Until next time, keep leading with purpose and turning grit into growth.